Hello to all, sprinkled around the globe. It's a delight to be here. I am not in Pari, but this does give me a chance to think about being there. So for you, those of you that might be, and those of you who are not, and those of you who have not yet been, maybe it's a thing to consider remedying. It's such a powerful place for both exchange, dialogue, growth, and everything. So again, I'm not in Pari. I'm in a humble, dusty place at the end of the road on the border with Mexico, but it does give me a moment to feel like I'm in Pari and be with a Pari family. So first of all, before we wade in and introduce Roderick, I'd like to share a personal little anecdote. I've been traveling for several weeks, and then back to my little humble abode here means a trip to the post office. And after several weeks, it's a small post office box crammed with goodies, and within that usually are several books, and some you don't even remember that you ordered. But as I was opening the mail in that spot, this was one of the books that I popped out, The Playful Universe. And in synchronistic fashion, there was a fellow that was just walked behind me, an acquaintance and a person that I don't know well, looked over my shoulder and saw the title and asked, The Playful Universe, what's that about? And so we had a 5 or 10 minute conversation talking about synchronicities, a playful universe. I'm glad Roderick wasn't there because my explanation probably wouldn't have been up to snuff. But it was a delightful conversation. And afterwards, he says, well, I've heard the term synchronicity, but I haven't really looked at what they are. And then a follow-up to that was just a couple of days later, yesterday or on Friday, in fact, I bumped into the same gentleman again. And he said, synchronicities, I thought about that and I've had some of those. And so it was fascinating to have another we talk and for him to delve into what that word means and also find those in his life. So I didn't think about it at that moment, but I am thinking next time I see him, I'll bet that he's probably found more in his life. And what a delight that is it'll be to hear. So anyway, onward we'll go. This is the middle weekend, the last day of the middle weekend of Beyond Jung, or Living Synchronicity. And Roderick has beautifully curated and brought together wonderful humans to give us their perspective on this wonderful topic. And so introducing Roderick, if you've been here before, you already know, but he is a BA and an MA from Oxford, his PhD from University of Lancaster. He's now at Exeter, director of the Center for Myth Studies. Maybe I'm missing some things. And I won't list the books that Roderick has written. We had the pleasure of meeting in Pari several years ago, but his books, I think there's 4 or so listed in the bio, and the name Jung or Synchronicity is in the title of each of them. So I think that's why he's curating this and doing such a fine job. So over to Roderick.
Thank you very much, Todd, for that introduction. And I thought it would be advisable to do one of these sessions myself, so that I'm not putting others through what I'm not willing to go through myself. And it also, because the theme of the series is one that is particularly sort of close to my own interests as well. So what I'm going to do is talk for about an hour to some PowerPoint slides, which I'm going to share now. Hopefully this will work. Can you see that well enough? Is that working? Yep, good. Thank you.
Yes.
So we've got the ubiquitous scarab there. So I'm going to go through this presentation, as I say, for maybe about an hour, and then hopefully there will be plenty of time left for questions. So the topic of the session is, I've just lost my slides for some reason. Where are they? Oh, here they are. The topic is synchronicity and Jung's holistic epistemology. So I'm going to basically talk about how, in my mind, synchronicity for Jung is addressing a particular problem he identified with the way in which we gain knowledge, and I'll look at how his own work is synchronicity and a causing connecting principle prominent amongst it is an exemplification of the sort of solution to that problem that he proposed. And then I'll also look at how some of the insights that emerge from his work on this topic can be applied in contemporary research and pedagogy, i.e. in modern universities. So first of all, synchronicity and the foundations of our epistemology. What was the problem that Jung was trying to address with the concept of synchronicity? He says early on in the essay that the problem of synchronicity concerns the foundations of our epistemology. Epistemology, the sort of reflection on the theory of how we acquire knowledge, how we get to know. And Jung was concerned in particular with scientific knowledge, with how we gain scientific knowledge and what he perceived to be limitations in the way in which we currently do that. And this is what he says early on in the essay. He says, the experimental method of inquiry, characteristic of modern science, aims at establishing regular events which can be repeated. Consequently, unique or rare events are ruled out of account. Moreover, the experiment imposes limiting conditions on nature, for its aim is to force her, nature, to give answers to questions devised by man, humanity, humans. Every answer of nature is therefore more or less influenced by the kind of questions asked, and the result is always a hybrid product. The so-called scientific view of the world based on this can hardly be anything more than a psychologically biased partial view, which misses out all those by no means unimportant aspects that cannot be grasped statistically. So modern science, based on the experimental method for Jung, produces a view of the world which he sees as being psychologically biased and partial, missing out a huge amount of our experience. He considers this to be a sort of a major problem for knowledge generally and across other areas of knowledge and the application of knowledge. So in one of my previous books, The Rupture of Time, I explored in detail how Jung, with his concept of synchronicity, was attempting to address this sort of problem, and in particular, what he saw as the problem of scientific rationalism. Not science as he would more broadly have wanted to understand it, but a sort of rationalistic form of science, which he considered to be very narrow, based on this experimental method. He was also concerned with how that sort of scientific rational view, which was was discussed in the first session with Rick Tarnas, had been sort of developing since the scientific revolution and the Enlightenment period in the 17th century, how that sort of approach also led to rationalistic approaches to religion, and ultimately, Jung thought, to a sort of kind of society that was organized over rationalistically and in turn spawned a kind of mass-minded behavior, which led eventually, in his view, to all the problems with totalitarianism and so on in the first half of the 20th century that he lived through. So these were some of the direct social and political consequences of this sort of narrow view for Jung. And more broadly, I think one can also relate it to the problem of disenchantment as characterized by Max Weber. And I wrote about this in more detail in my more recent book, Breaking the Spell of Disenchantment, how disenchantment, a viewpoint based on a sort of excessive rationalization, intellectualization, and bureaucratization, sort of results in a culture in which genuine mystery is denied, in which there is no acknowledgement of intrinsic meaning in reality. Any meaning that's there is supposed to be foisted on by humans from their interiority, but not really to be there in the world, and how it undermines any sense of relationship to the sacred. And Jung's work on synchronicity, I see largely as an attempt to address these social, cultural, political, environmental, and spiritual problems, as well as psychological problems. Um, so that stem from this sort of disenchanted view. So what solution to all of this did Jung propose? Well, he saw it as a problem fundamentally with our epistemology, with how we know, how we get knowledge. So he proposed a different approach to knowledge. Basically, he proposed to make our approach to knowledge more holistic. And he proposed to do this in three, well, I suppose, well, the three ways in which I would highlight, which are sort of aspects of the way in which he proposed to do this. First of all, he advocated thinking acausally, and we'll discuss what that means. But not thinking acausally as an alternative to thinking in the kind of causal way that is characteristic of science, but complementing that scientific causal way of thinking with an acausal way of thinking. And he also emphasized how synchronicity fosters a process of psychological, spiritual development, which he called individuation. So we'll talk about those three aspects of his more holistic epistemology. So let's start with thinking acausally. This, for Jung, I mean, one way in which he talks about it is a way of thinking in terms of the whole. So not sort of thinking analytically, breaking things up into smaller units and understanding those units and then piecing them back together to understand a larger entity or whole or situation that one wants to understand, but somehow finding a way of thinking about the whole in itself. He referred to the ancient Chinese divinatory system of the I Ching as a method of thinking in terms of the whole. It's that sort of, it's a way of apprehending whatever it is one's looking at in all its aspects without concerning oneself with how one part of something sort of causes another, or how the whole thing that one's looking at emerged causally from prior events and so on. It's trying to understand its meaning as a whole in the present. So this is in a nutshell what he means by thinking acausally. One of the advantages of this and one of the characteristics of it is that it enables one to attend to exceptional events, causally inexplicable events, events that we often don't even notice because they don't seem to make sense in relation to the normal cause and effect relationships by which we understand our world. Events that are evanescent, that are difficult to believe in, not easy to connect with established knowledge. So Jung's thinking acausally is very much about attending to those unique, singular, unusual, sometimes outright anomalous events that can occur. It's also about attending to patterns of meaning that emerge among causally unconnected psychic and physical events, events that you've got no reason to think are causally related, something one's thinking or something one dreams or something one fantasizes, and physical events that are going on somewhere, either in one's immediate environment or elsewhere, but that one becomes aware of later. No reason to think of those as being causally connected, and yet often it happens that one can find discern or suspect patterns of meaning amongst those events, that they're falling together in a particular way that that makes some kind of deep sense. So thinking acausally enables one to do this, and it's a way, in a sense, of using the functions of intuition and imagination to grasp something of the archetypal background of events, of the sort of deep structure that is informing the way in which events have fallen together. And Jung's sort of introduces the notion of the archetype here as a Rick Tarnas was talking about formal causes, and the archetype is, in this sense, is a formal cause underlying how or why these events have come together. And by interrogating this archetypal background, this archetypal pattern that can reveal itself in the configuration of psychic, causally unconnected psychic and physical events, by interpreting its meaning at various levels, one can discern what this event signifies or what it means. And there are, as I say, various levels at which one can interpret the meaning, interpret it emotionally, or in terms of its meaning for one personally, in terms of one's own individuation or process of transformation, or one can just explore its meaning archetypally, transpersonally, not necessarily specifically to do with oneself. There are various sort of levels and depths at which one can explore its meaning. So thinking acausally does all of these things. But that's not the only sort of way in which Jung's thought is holistic, because as I said, he's not advocating thinking acausally as an alternative to thinking causally. He's seeing the two as in some way belonging together. So towards the end of his synchronicity essay, he makes this statement. He's been talking about the triad of classical physics: space, time, and causality. And he says, by introducing synchronicity, you sort of supplement those other factors, and you get what he calls a tetrad or a quaternio, which makes possible a whole judgment. So and he sort of draws this little quaternio diagram where he's got an axis of space and time, and then another axis with causality on the one side, but complemented by synchronicity on the other. So these are not ways of looking that can be sort of merged with one another. They're complementary to one another. But in order to get a whole judgment of a situation, he suggests that we need to be able to see in both ways. We need to be able to see causally, in the kind of way that science trains us to do, but also we need to be able to see things acausally in the kind of way that the principle of synchronicity is explaining and accounting for. So seeing the holistic acausal meaning as complementary to, not alternative to, causal understanding is a major part of what Jung's talking about when he's introducing this more holistic epistemology. And this involves, just to be clear, using critical, causal, rational thinking, not rejecting it in any sense, using it, in fact, to temper and test one's intuitions, as well as to refine and deepen one's interpretations. But it also involves using one's intuitive and imaginative apprehensions, the sorts of seeing in terms of the whole, thinking in terms of the whole, to guide and check one's rational mind. So that the two ways of looking, the causal and the acausal, are, as it were, complementing, balancing, checking each other, and one is seeking the right balance between them. So I think in his essay, that is very much what he is attempting to advocate. It's the introduction of something that is complementing, not something that is replacing an existing way of thinking. But there's another way in which synchronicity is inherently holistic and helps with a sort of a holistic epistemology, and that is through fostering this process that Jung calls individuation, because the archetypes that Jung thinks underpin synchronistic experiences manifest themselves, he explains in his psychological model, compensatorily. That is, as forms of compensation for the particular state of consciousness that happens to be prominent or prevalent at the time. And it does this in order to advance the process that he calls individuation, the process of psychological or spiritual development. And that process, individuation, for Jung, leads to realization of what for him is the overarching archetype, the archetype of the self, the archetype of wholeness. So that for Jung, any synchronicity that in a sense is expressing an archetype, in the sense that archetype is part of an overall process that leads towards or in however small a way, leads towards this fuller realization of the archetype of wholeness, the self. It is in that sense, it has a holistic tendency within it. So synchronistic experiences and a synchronistic way of looking, a synchronistic kind of attention, are inherently holistic through fostering individuation in this way. And in his late work, Mysterium Conjunctionis, Jung makes clear that this idea of wholeness goes all the way to the most profound forms of mystical experience, to what he calls, right at the end of that magisterial work, the union of the self, the union of the integrated self, that is, the union of the self that has integrated spirit, psyche, and body, the union of that self with what he calls there the unus mundus, the one world, the world of potential, or the archetypal world underpinning the empirical world. And that union results, he says, in a state, the state that has been described by mystics as unio mystica. And he compares that cross-culturally with other terms such as Tao that we were hearing about yesterday, or Satori in the Zen tradition, or in Samadhi in the Indian tradition. So this idea of holism or wholeness that Jung's talking about is not just it's not just at a psychological level. He's talking about it at the deepest possible level, and a sort of mystical level. Not that that would necessarily be foregrounded in every kind of experience, but I think he's implying that there is this sort of quality of moving in this direction about these experiences. So through its involvement of archetypes, synchronicity in this way sort of unites not only the psychic and the physical, so that would be a sort of horizontal connection, connectedness that's established within the world of our experience, our psychic experiences and physical experiences. They're united by the meaning that is emerging in synchronicities. But it's also uniting the empirical world as a whole, these psychic and physical archetypal images, with the ground out of which they come, the archetype as such, the transcendent level. So that's a more sort of a vertical kind of unity that's being established as well. And this leads to sort of various conceptions that Jung alludes to a couple of places in his Synchronicity essay as a unity of being, or a sort of vision of the sort of total interconnectedness of reality, as he writes about in Mysterium Conjunctionis. So again, very profound understanding of the sort of holistic implications of this way of looking, that he's trying to advocate for with his concepts of synchronicity. So, having sort of just sort of outlined what I understand him to be in a nutshell arguing in his essay, of course, there's a lot more complexity in the essay than that. It occurred to me that one ought really to be able to see this kind of holistic epistemology at work in Jung's own work. If this is what he's advocating for, does he actually walk the walk, as it were? Does he do what he's saying he's going to do? And I'd just like to turn now to look a little bit at Jung's Synchronicity essay, and to see whether and to what extent he perhaps does that. Or we can see whether he might be doing that. So we'll take the same headings, those three ideas, starting with thinking acausally. And I think, one thing, one can see that Jung does acknowledge exceptional, one-off, anomalous experiences. His book, his text is replete with them, with extraordinary coincidences, with the kind of extrasensory perception and psychokinesis data, with sort of discussions of divinations, even with altered states of consciousness, like out-of-body experiences and near-death experiences. All of these really difficult to understand phenomena are faced head-on in Jung's text. He's not turning away from them. He's taking them as things that he needs to understand, and he's finding ways of making sense of them. So in that sense, he is thinking acausal. He's looking at these phenomena, even though he can't make immediate causal sense of them. And one of still on this sort of way of thinking acausally, one of the things he does is to identify the archetypal patterns of meaning that might be involved in these experiences through not sort of logical inference or any direct sort of empirical inferences or whatever, but largely using intuition and imagination. He identifies themes such as unity, the idea of the relationship between the microcosm of the psyche and the macrocosm of the world. He identifies the archetypal theme of the relationship between the third and the fourth, or the trinity and the quaternity, expressing this in sort of alchemical terms. So there are certain archetypal patterns that he sees at work in the very project that he's got of trying to articulate this concept of synchronicity. So that diagram I showed earlier, which had space and time and causality, that's a trinity, and he was adding the fourth term of synchronicity to that to make it into a quaternity. So these are themes, explicit themes that he was talking about. But I think one can also see that there are in his work themes that perhaps he didn't himself foreground. Maybe he wasn't entirely conscious of them, but his approach creatively admits these other patterns into his work. One is the idea of the theme of the trickster or Mercurius, a sort of shadowy figure that can sort of make mischief with things one's doing. And there are a couple of interesting ways in which the presence of that can be seen in Jung's essay. One is in his astrological experiment, where he starts off the experiment seeming to be wanting to do use statistics and a sort of experiment in the fashion of J.B. Rhine's parapsychological experiments to try and say something about synchronicity and about the sort of what kind of astrological backgrounds people have who get married. But it turns out in the end that as an experiment, as a sort of a statistical experiment, it gets completely derailed. But Jung finds that instead something strange happens in the experiment, which is that it shows the appearance of supporting astrological expectations, but in fact is not doing so in any scientific way. It's only doing so because of Jung's psychic sort of interventions or psychic emotionality, that he decides to investigate the material at a certain point. And when he does that, he gets certain maximal figures that seem significant. He does it again, he can't resist, can't hold out any longer, and he gets excited and wants to examine his material. And when he does it, another astrologically significant pair of conjunctions comes out as the most prominent one. And this happens a third time. You take those three times together and it looks remarkably significant in a way. But in fact, you add them all together and statistically it's utterly meaningless or insignificant and wouldn't sort of interest any sort of serious scientist and so on. So it created an impression of being meaningful, but in fact wasn't. And Jung sees this itself as a form of synchronicity. That it's creating, because of his emotional involvement, something happens which is unexpected and creates the appearance of this significant event, the significance for astrology, which is not actually there. So and he acknowledges this, he observes it to his credit in the essay, and sees that he's being made, being fooled around with. And he even says that whilst he was working on the essay, he saw in the walls of this, in his Bollingen retreat, he saw in the wall a kind of in the stonework, a sort of the image of a face in the shadows, sort of looking out and laughing at him. And he later carved that into a figure of the trickster in sort of commemoration, really, of how he got sort of messed around with, as it were, in this intriguing way whilst writing the essay. I'll leave it just to that one example of the trickster. The idea of the anima mundi is something that sort of slips in. He mentions the idea several times in his when he's discussing forerunners of the idea of synchronicity. He also refers several times in the essay to nature as a she. He seems to be personifying nature in some way, and he also gives his classic example is of this female patient who seems to have lost her soul and then sort of recovers it. And although he's talking about an individual case, the choice of example also seems to reflect this idea of the recovery of the soul. And the work that Jung and in collaboration with Wolfgang Pauli were doing, they saw as being a sort of retrieval of this pre-modern Renaissance and medieval idea of the anima mundi and the ancient sort of Neoplatonic idea of the anima mundi, the soul of the world, that rather than being desouled and utterly disenchanted and meaningless, the world has this sort of spirit and meaningfulness about it. Another theme that is lurking in the background of Jung's essay, another archetypal theme, I think, is that of sacred marriage. This is something that has been well brought out by Remo Roth, actually, whose books were published by the Paris Center. One of his books, his third one, I think, is called Holy Wedding, and brings out this important aspect of Jung's work. And it's not made very explicit by Jung, for sure, but I think one can infer that its importance in a number of ways. First of all, Jung broke off. Jung was at the time he wrote his synchronicity essay. Jung had been working on Mysterium Conjunctionis, and he broke off that work in order to write the synchronicity essay, plus one or two other things like Answer to Job. But the Mysterium Conjunctionis is all about the sacred marriage and the hieroskamos. That's what it is, the mystery of the conjunction. The conjunction is this sacred marriage. So Jung's work on synchronicity is very much embedded in that sort of work on sacred marriage. It's a sort of it's in a space that he created within the midst of that work. So that's one aspect of the marriage. Another aspect is the fact that in the astrological experiment, Jung compares several hundred horoscopes of married pairs. He chooses to look at marriage as an astrological sort of fact, or and to look at the conjunctions relating to marriage. He says just because it's practical and it's observable, it's a real fact that one can observe. But I think one could suspect that it's also symbolically quite resonant with what he's doing in the whole essay, to be focusing on this, and that it was perhaps not so entirely arbitrary that he chose that sort of psychological fact of marriage as being something that he would investigate. And then there's the synchronistic phenomenon itself joins together very different phenomena: the psychic aspect of our experience and the physical aspect of our experience. In what you could call a marriage, and what in fact in his second book on synchronicity, David Peat, the founder of the center that's hosting us, called the marriage of can't remember whether it's psyche and matter or mind and matter, but certainly he used the word marriage in the title there. So I think this is a very important theme too. And maybe I should not. Maybe I should. I mean, I've been deliberately bracketing out Wolfgang Pauli from my discussion simply because that brings in lots and lots of complications and enriching. But of course, it's interesting that this was important to Pauli as well. Pauli was Jung's great collaborator. There's a marriage between the physicist and the psychologist in the joining together of their two essays in the joint book, The Interpretation of Nature and the Psyche. And Pauli, he came to see Jung when his own marriage broke down. His marriage to a cabaret dancer performer that broke down, and he'd married the cabaret singer because his mother had, after in an emotionally disturbed state, after his mother committed suicide because of his father's marital infidelity. Multiple marital infidelity. So there were problems in the marriage that led to his disastrous marriage. And then he had therapy with Jung, and he ended the therapy with Jung when he got remarried to Franca Bertram, to whom he, who eventually outlived him. And that seemed to be a very successful marriage. So marriage was a big theme in Pauli's story as well, particularly in relation to his engagement with Jung. So this idea of sacred marriage is also sort of somehow constellating in the experience of Jung and indeed of Pauli. And then a fourth theme that I think can be seen in the background is the theme of death and rebirth. In the Synchronicity essay, Jung's classic example, of course, is about the scarab beetle, a symbol of rebirth. There's a second example that he gives about the death of a patient when a flock of birds lands on the roof of the house, and his wife is the man's wife is concerned, and the man dies eventually. And several other of the examples Jung gives involve death. Late in the fourth chapter, he includes a near-death experience as an example of how consciousness might be able to exist independently of the body and so on. These themes of death and rebirth are very important in the essay. And Jung wrote in his memoirs about a near-death experience he'd had in 1944 when he had a heart attack, and that experience has at its core a very important synchronicity, and also it has visions of the sacred marriage. So there's a very sort of powerful constellation in Jung's experience relating to this too. So I think it's interesting to see how thinking acausally about Jung's experience can take us right into the sort of depths of what's going on in his experience, really, in his thinking. So that's thinking acausally. Turning now to how, in Jung's case, he complements thinking acausally with thinking in normal causal ways, and this will go a bit more quickly, this bit. First of all, Jung, of course, doesn't just purely write out of intuition. He draws on mainstream science and mainstream scholarship with all their causality-based methods in order to establish his argument. He's definitely not rejecting science and traditional scholarship. He's using them as well as he can in the context to establish his argument for going beyond them, or for complementing them. So he writes about physics, and he writes about the history of religions, he writes about the philosophy of science, and many other things, drawing as authoritatively as he can. He wants us to believe, he wants us to feel that what he says about these topics is as sound as it can be in mainstream terms, in order to establish the basis for introducing something new, going beyond it, and ultimately revising our understanding of all these things. So he's not trying to prioritize acausality at the expense of causality. He's trying to create a kind of synthesis of the two. He also, interestingly, draws on more marginal disciplines that have already, used causal methods to investigate acausal phenomena, such as psychical research and parapsychology. So, these are methods that try to use science to understand, the bizarre phenomena. So Jung is open to that. He's not just, looking at sort of fanciful accounts. He's interested in a intellectually robust understanding of the phenomena. And similarly, he notes that various heterodox forms of thought that date from before the dominance of material and efficient causality, the kind of causality that is dominant in science, came about. So he writes about various views of esotericism, alchemy, mysticism, and so on. These are views that in which, as it were, a split between causal thinking and acausal thinking hadn't yet taken place, because you hadn't got this sort of purified version of causality that emerged in the 17th century, around the 17th century, and became ensconced in the scientific method. So Jung is interested in complementing, not replacing causality in his essay. And also, I think one can see that Jung is concerned with the idea of fostering individuation, fostering this sense of realization of an archetype of wholeness, a process that leads towards realization of greater wholeness. So this is clear in the examples of synchronicity that he gives. Scarab case being the classic one, where the patient, after she has her synchronicity with the scarab, her process of development, her process of individuation is enabled to continue. It breaks through the sort of blockage in her development and enables her process to continue with good results, Jung says. In terms of the actual experience of synchronicity, individuation, he explains, is very important. But I think you can also see that in the work he's doing something a bit grander, or attempting to do something a bit grander, which is to help with the individuation of science itself. In other words, making science more whole, turning it from a purely causal-based way of approaching knowledge to a much more holistic based approach. And he does this by identifying and integrating into science a number of things. That one is the sort of various disavowed content, including the role of the psyche in the active role of the psyche, the inalienable role of the psyche in doing scientific work. In most descriptions of scientific work, the role of the psyche is downplayed as much as possible. Jung's view, I think, is that you have to take it into account. It's going to be present, and it's actually saturating the whole process of doing science or acquiring scholarly knowledge in many ways. Other disavowed content are the exceptional phenomena that Jung draws our attention to, the meaningful coincidences and the other anomalous phenomena, and also the rejected concepts, such as the medieval and Renaissance concept of correspondence, or, as we saw, the concept of the anima mundi. He's trying to reintegrate these sorts of concepts into an understanding of science with his concept of synchronicity. He refers to synchronicity on one occasion as a modern differentiation of the obsolete concept of correspondence, harmony, and sympathy. So he's trying to find a new way of thinking about these concepts that is compatible with and or at least is able to complement and work alongside the ways of thinking that have become characteristic of science. He also tries to integrate into science these underlying images of wholeness, to find the processes of transformation that are at work in the narratives that are informing the doing of science, and to find the images of wholeness, that the quaternios, the presence of a principle like Dao in the Chinese understanding, that is more objectively sort of involved in the sort of unfolding of knowing, without it being, you know, something that is totally controlled from a sort of an ego-centered human perspective, if you like. And also his notion of synchronicity helps to, or points towards the possibility of developing a viable holistic ontology, a sense of an understanding of being, of the nature of reality, which is unitary, a unitary idea of being he refers to very explicitly. The idea being that the materialistic ontology that's been characteristic of most of the sort of mainstream science in Jung's day, and still today, in fact, you know, is in some way challenged, or in many ways challenged by introducing this concept of synchronicity, forcing one to think about other possible ontological perspectives, which don't presuppose materialism. You know, one sort of example would be the dual aspect monist view that Suzanne referred to, work of Harold Atmanspacher and colleagues, which sees matter and mind as being two aspects of a deeper psychophysically neutral underlying reality, what Jung would call the psychoid archetypal reality. So it pushes one to see that science does not need to be based on materialism. It can be based on deeper, more expansive ontological visions. So those are some of the sort of ways in which I think you can see that Jung's insights were reflexively already at work in his essay, in which he, as it were, expounded those insights. And but my own concern, obviously, is you know, what can we do with this? You know, it's great fun to read about, and very powerful to read about. But can it be integrated in any way or applied to contemporary research and pedagogy? And you know, I think it can, and I just want to sort of talk about a few ways in which I think you know, I've found that it might. So I'm going to just go through the same kind of categories again in a moment. But first of all, I just want to give a few examples from my own experience, if you'll bear with me, of how synchronicity has played into my own engagements with the academy. I mean, perhaps there'll be just one main example that I'll give, but I'll briefly maybe mention a few others. So I'll calling this first one doctoral initiations, and I'm just going to actually read the account, because otherwise I won't be able to say it very concisely. So as part of my work at the University of Essex, that's what we see in the background here in the United Kingdom, I received an application from someone who wanted to study a PhD under my supervision. It was a topic related to Jung's psychology and to synchronicity. So that was very much my areas of interest. And I was naturally kind of well disposed to take the applicant on. But I felt that the proposal in its present form didn't really demonstrate sufficient academic rigor to give me confidence that the project would be realized successfully. So I didn't accept the proposal in it straight away, but made some suggestions for improvement and invited the applicant to send me a revised version. When that arrived, the revised version arrived a few months later, I still wasn't entirely persuaded, but I nevertheless invited the applicant to an interview to discuss the proposal in more detail. During the course of our interview, we touched on various issues raised by the applicant's proposal and had just begun to discuss the issue of the relationship between synchronicity and time. Then the phone rang in my office. The caller was Dr. Robert Aziz, who was phoning from Canada. As many of you will know, Aziz is the author of a book, C.G. Jung's Psychology of Religion and Synchronicity, published in 1990. This book had greatly influenced my own work on synchronicity over the previous 15 years and more. And Aziz's book had originated from his PhD thesis, which he had undertaken in the Department of Religious Studies at Lancaster University in the UK. It was in the same department, and indeed under the same supervisor, Adrian Cunningham, that I undertook my own PhD studies on synchronicity a few years after Aziz. In fact, my supervisor once told me that he had been in two minds about taking on the supervision of another project on synchronicity, but had decided to do so on receiving a complimentary copy of Aziz's book shortly before he was due to interview me in relation to my application. So the phone call now was the first time that I'd had any direct contact with Aziz. He was phoning to ask if I would endorse his new book, The Synthetic Paradigm, The Untrodden Path Beyond Freud and Jung. Since I was in the middle of a meeting, we arranged an alternative time to speak and ended the present call. Now, receiving a phone call out of the blue from Aziz would have had significance for me at any time, but it seemed all the more significant now, occurring as it did just as I was interviewing an applicant about the possibility of his undertaking a PhD on a topic involving Jungian psychology and synchronicity. I mentioned to the applicant who it was that had just phoned, and he was even more surprised than I was. For while I was preoccupied with the phone call, he had continued looking at his notes on the topic we'd been discussing, synchronicity and time. As he eagerly showed me, he had been reading a short passage he had copied out from one of my books, The Rupture of Time, in which I was quoting something on synchronicity and time written by Robert Aziz. So, you know, I mean, just to sort of summarize that, I mean, so at the moment when I was interviewing him about the possibility of undertaking a PhD on a topic involving synchronicity, I received a phone call from someone who, first of all, was the author of one of the most important books on synchronicity. Secondly, had inadvertently influenced my own acceptance to study for a PhD on synchronicity by arranging for a complimentary copy of his book to be sent to my prospective supervisor just before I was due to be interviewed. And third, with this phone call, was making our first ever direct contact after over 15 years of indirect association. And fourth, at the precise moment when I was on the phone, my PhD applicant happened to read in his notes a passage he'd copied from one of my books in which I was quoting from the earlier book by the person on the other end of the phone. So it was really quite a sort of remarkable sort of confluence of events as I experienced it and as the applicant experienced it. And as an addendum, I suppose I should say that I did take on the PhD student and I did write an endorsement for Aziz's new book. And the decision in relation to the student, who I can now reveal was Matthew Mather, turned out to be a good one, as the thesis he eventually wrote earned him his PhD and was itself subsequently published as a book, The Alchemical Mercurius Esoteric Symbol of Jung's Life and Works. In relation to Aziz's book, The Synthetic Paradigm, perhaps I can also mention that this was published at exactly the same time as my book, Revelations of Chance, a book that was mostly based on research I'd done for my PhD. And in fact, our books appeared both published by the State University of New York Press, SUNY, and they were advertised on adjacent pages of the SUNY catalogue for spring 2007. So, you know, the sort of connections sort of continued to unfold. So, I mean, I mentioned that just as an intricate, quite complicated example of the way in which sort of outside of anything that I could have controlled or anybody could have controlled, something seemed to be happening which related to, I suppose, the initiation of Matthew Mather's doctoral studies. You know, his acceptance of, you know, it contributed to my accepting him as a student, broke my resistance, if you like, a bit like Jung's patient, I suppose, or like Jung himself, when in the example that Rick Tarnos gave last week, when considering the publication of the book and when his watch stopped. But it also connected to my own doctoral initiation, if you like, that Aziz had sent his book to who was the person who was to be my supervisor, and that was had sort of broken Adrian Cunningham's resistance or doubt, irresolution about whether he should accept me as a student. So the pattern is very complicated, but suggests that things sometimes can be afoot in this field which are not really, have their own sort of pattern and momentum that is larger than our individual sort of wishes and plans and so on could possibly put together. Now I've got several other sort of incidents, but I'm not going to, or examples, but I'm not going to sort of go through them. I can come back to them if anyone wants me to in the discussion. But I'd like just quickly to go through a few in the remaining sort of five or 10 minutes, just to go through a few of the ways in which I think, or I have found, that I can turn all this work on synchronicity and this thinking about synchronicity and its holistic implications to account in the work that I do as an academic in a modern university. So one way is simply, focusing on thinking acausally is simply to include exceptional acausal experiences in such as synchronicity, apparitions, altered states of consciousness, as content in my own research, but also in my teaching. There's no reason to exclude any of this material. It's totally bizarre, but there's no reason that one can't. There are things that happen. There's no reason that one cannot include them. So I teach a module on an undergraduate module on dream, myth, and magic, in which I discuss, amongst many other things, synchronicity. We run a master's program in which several of the seminars that I contribute touch on these sorts of areas, and I have supervised and continue to supervise doctoral theses on that include these kinds of topics, and why not? They are phenomena of reality, and they deserve to be understood and better than they are, and research done on them. In addition to just including these kinds of experiences, I think one can also promote methods of study that deploy the kinds of thinking that are fostered and promoted by thinking acausally in relation to synchronicity. That is analogical thinking, intuition, imagination, and taking into account researcher subjectivity. So I've supervised projects and taught modules on seminars on hermeneutics, on doing comparisons, on interpretive phenomenological analysis, autoethnography, and so on. And these sort of methods, more qualitative methods, which of course they're not uncommon in academic work, particularly in the social sciences and perhaps in the humanities, are much more friendly to and helpful in sort of allowing a kind of synchronistic perspective to enter into the frame. But I've also, I confess, not beyond attending to synchronistic experiences of my own, as you like the one I just mentioned, and also divinatory readings in relation to academic career moves, into whether or not I should undertake certain projects, or when I encounter writing blocks, I will often sort of explore that writing block, perhaps with the I Ching, in order to understand better what's going on in myself. And very often I found that can kind of loosen things and get the work moving again in directions that I hadn't anticipated. So thinking acausally can certainly be integrated into academic work in these ways. As for complementing causality with acausality, I mean, this is, it sort of goes without saying, really, that I expect of myself and I expect of my students and others other scholars that I interact with, that that we all maintain traditional high standards of scholarship. There's no sense that just sort of dreamily mellowing, chilling out with the sense and feeling of unusual experiences is going to sort of in itself help to advance our understanding or knowledge. The traditional academic methods and processes and standards are totally compatible with being interested in all these other things. So and I would expect any work on it to be done as to as good a level as possible. And that would involve testing. Well, two things really. It would involve testing insights that are obtained acausally, as it were, through intuitive methods against more traditionally, causally, if you like, established knowledge, and then integrating them with each other wherever possible, so that the intuitively obtained insights are corroborated where they can be, and with existing established knowledge. But it also involves, on my part anyway, refusing to see these kind of more intuitive methods as necessarily conflicting with or inferior to causal methods. There's a sense of, yes, well, you can use a little bit of intuition, a little bit of imagination. All science needs to do that every now and then, and so on. But actually, it's they're the sort of they're the sort of the poor relative and the unimportant part of the process. I don't see it that way. I think it's of at least as important as thinking in a more sort of causally, logically rational way. And as a result, I quite strongly resist the widespread prioritizing that one sees in contemporary culture of STEM, that is science, technology, engineering, and mathematics subjects over humanities subjects, where it's the humanities subjects that are much more sensitive to and able to develop ways of reading these sort of less tangible patterns of meaning and so on, that deal much more with interpretation and meaning. And I think people perhaps educated in the humanities probably have, in some respects, have an easier time of it in understanding how to extract meaning from synchronicities. But I don't want to push that point. But anyway, I certainly don't think STEM subjects have any great priority in my mind, or should have the priority that they're given, just because they can generate, sort of the sound of lots of coins rattling around. And as for fostering individuation, I find that increasingly I consider transformational and transpersonal significance of a project as criteria when deciding about taking on whether it's a research project or a teaching project. How do I anticipate that this project is going to be useful for me to develop as a person individuationally? What signs are there in my own sort of observation of things that this is actually objectively, regardless of my own personal motivations, an important subject to take on? I think synchronicity and thinking acausally can help one to see these, trying to see what's going on at an archetypal level can help one to see and be motivated by these sort of deeper currents, if you like, rather than often more purely pragmatic reasons. And similarly, I encourage students, I think one can encourage students to find their own deepest connection to what it is that they're working on, not to do things because they think they should, or because they just want, instrumentally to get a certain result, to do an easy topic because it will get them a higher mark, which will lead them to greater affluence or something like this. I think find something that really has a real meaning, and connect to it, and that will give the motivation to work on it in a deep way, and actually to effect some personal transformation through the process. In our work. There's, at ethics, we've been introducing more reflective learning that requires the inclusion of subjective responses into students' learning, so they're not just sort of thinking about the technical processes of studying and learning, but being more reflective. And I know this, again, this is something that's widely done, but I think it's underpinned by Jung's argument, if you like, for a more holistic approach to learning, to knowledge. And one thing we've also recently, or we're in the process of doing, is including seeing whether we can include intuition, imagination, and reflectivity, and perhaps there are other things as well among assessment criteria, across the board for assignments, essays or dissertations or whatever it is, so that these qualities, which are normally overlooked or downgraded, actually get foregrounded, so that we become more used to actually looking out for them, sensing them, and rewarding them, if you like, affirming them. So in these various ways, I think the implications of a more holistic epistemology are continually informing my own work within my academic milieu, quite apart from the synchronistic experiences that do happen now and then. So, in conclusion, then, this is what I feel I've said, just to refresh the overall structure of what I've said. I've argued that Jung's concept of synchronicity aimed to address a problem with the foundations of our epistemology. It's one-sidedly rational approach, which is psychologically biased and gives a partial view. He attempted to introduce a more holistic epistemology. And that holistic epistemology involves thinking acausally, complementing causal and acausal with acausal thinking, and promoting a sort of purposeful teleological or final cause dimension or aspect that Jung called individuation. And we can see traces of how this epistemological outlook, I think, influenced Jung's own work, including the very work in which he expressed it, his essay on synchronicity. And I've tried just to give a sketch or a flavor of some of what I think are the many ways in which this kind of holistic epistemology could inform contemporary research and pedagogy in modern contemporary present day contexts. So with that, I finish.
Okay, this is Todd again. I'm not sure if I'm spotlighted, but this is the first time we've done this. So technically, put up with whatever comes up. But let me thank Roderick deeply. What a privilege to hear again. You bring so much to it, both the passion and the scholarship. My privilege was in meeting Roderick a couple years ago in Pari when he presented on Jung this subject in deeper. But what it was for me in that moment was, those of us that are not Jungian analysts or involved in scholarship on Jung, we all have sort of a dilettante's level of understanding, and we might think that we have a basis or of understanding what Jung meant and otherwise. But Roderick, for me, allowed to look below the hood and help come up with some much deeper areas of inquiry. And so it's a treasure again now to listen to you, who has brought this series together and curated, and the other minds that are deeply engaged to hear once again. It's also not just an exposition on Jung, but as you, Roderick, you brought it to the forefront of what it means for a current world situation and a future. And to me, that is what the pertinence of Jung is, not explaining how we were and are, but how it's manifestly important to have those points in the future. The whole resistance against a purely causal way of looking is where we're getting at, looking over an edge or an abyss by thinking only in a mechanistic, a causal way. And so that plea to bring back in, at your level at the university, but in society, that other aspect of the mystery of the acausal and just those delights of synchronicity. I originally was going to ask Roderick how it's worked out in your world. It's an area of scholarship and personal engagement, but you did share the story of the young man that went onward with those series of synchronistic moments that reinforce that. I'm wondering if you'll keep in touch with him to see if there's another chapter of that in his world, where something intervenes, where somebody else is given a chance onward by a synchronistic series of events that that seems like it's been 3 in a row, and maybe there's a fourth with this fellow Matthew, that whatever he does in the world.
Well, I can tell you what he does. He's he was working in a sort of I think it was sort of a sort of an institute in Ireland somewhere, working in sort of environmental technologies or something. But he sort of segued into teaching more on sort of Jungian psychology in relation to arts-based research or something like this. And he now does that. He's continued to publish on this area of synchronicity, and he supervises PhDs himself and so on. So he's become an academic. So the continuation is there. Yeah.
I wonder he'll have a moment where the phone rings in the same office situation.
Well,
out of curiosity, I'm wondering, in the moment where that occurred between you and him in the phone call from Aziz, did you share in the moment your astonishment at that set of synchronicities, or did you share it with him afterwards? Just a curious personal question.
Well, and it was difficult to keep it out of the conversation. It was quite, it was quite obvious, that because I told him who had phoned, and he was reading it, and I mean, what I didn't do was sort of say, oh well, immediately, oh well, that sort of resolves all my doubts, and I'll accept you as a student. I factored it into the other considerations, but it was certainly a factor. It was, there was something very living and real about his engagement, and I think there is. I think he's yeah.
To find the play of synchronicities in my life, it's a delight to hear and share of those of the others. And thank you again for your plea to re-elevate, to re-recognize interiority in the humanities, because as we know, where we've gotten so far by disprizing that is where we've gotten, and what we see next needs to have humanities within. So thank you for that plea, publicly, academically, and otherwise. And if you don't have anything next, we'll go to questions. I don't know how many hands are up. I'm on an iPad, so I can't see all, but I'll ask for Michael's assistance in how to proceed with questions.
Okay, great. Let's move on to questions. Be right with you.
Looks
okay.
Looks like we have a hand up with Bruce.
Oh, yes, Roderick. I sure wish I had run into you in my academic career a long time ago. But as it is, I'm a soil scientist and a geologist. And in the late 70s, because of the embargo, I got a BS, Bachelor of Science in Geology and Petroleum Geology. And at the time, of course, I wanted to really get that job because I needed a job. But then I didn't get a job with the petroleum industry. I finally got a job, mapping soils, with the federal government. And I finally realized that synchronicities can seem rather negative at first until you kind of figure them out. And I'm just thinking, what would have happened if I'd got a job with the oil companies? Talk about lose my soul. Right. So yeah, I recognize that. I mean, so synchronicities, do have this thing that they're not always tea and kittens, but sometimes the negative things are very significant, synchronicities. And, in the state of the world today, we have to wonder, what is the meaning of all this? And I think, you summarize it quite perfectly that, it's too much STEM, too much technology. We got too much technology and not enough common sense. And so it also seems to come around to free will, because free will is usually considered as the ego will, whereas the higher self will is the real will. Jung mentions many times how the higher self can be quite brutal if it needs to get somebody's attention. And so yeah, this is all just really great stuff. But how has free will, so-called, I mean, free will is, the ego will is really sort of very thin. It's based on the last commercial you saw for what your choices, but the higher self will is our real will. It seems to me. Does that sound consistent with what you have come across?
Yeah, well, I mean, I think something like this was said in one of the previous talks in this series, that I think the Jung's quote from Mysterium Conjunctionis, where he says that an experience of the self, that is this kind of higher will, if you like, is always a defeat for the ego, you know, and that from the perspective of our sort of narrow purposes and interests, to get what we want is not always necessarily the best thing, and that sometimes, you know, for that to be thwarted, that sort of will to be thwarted, with as some sort of larger pattern for our lives emerges, can be a good thing, painful though it may be, difficult though it may be to accept at the time, disappointing though it may be. So yeah, I mean, I think what you said, you know, is perfectly consonant with the way I understand would understand synchronicity and its relationship to you know, the way in which the self and the ego are experienced.
Okay. All right. Well, thank you.
Yeah, thank you.
And thank you, Bruce. I apologize. I didn't see the order of people have their hands up. I'm on iPad, so I'm a little bit behind on that. But I believe Daniel had yours up first. If you'd like to go in.
I
Daniel.
did. Thank you very much, Roderick. Thank you so much for a wonderful presentation.
Thank you.
I am deep into your book, Breaking the Spell of Disenchantment. My background as an analyst is in hospice and palliative care and end of life, and decades of experience have accumulated all kinds of synchronicities that I think eventually compelled me to become an analyst. But my question, if you could go back to your example of synchronicity, and this idea of disenchantment and re-enchantment, and talk about it and for using that paradigm, because in my work in end of life, the disenchantment becomes so tyrannical or tyrannically driven with medicine and the medical model. And there are these samples of synchronicities that occur at end of life are, I think, attempts to re-enchant with not much attention to that, but I think the attempts there. So can you talk about your experience in that language?
Yeah, maybe that experience that I gave, I'm not sure how helpful that one will be, because it's, you know, I mean, I think both the applicant and myself, we're already kind of, you know, we're already very open to kind of, you know, the enchanted happenings, as it were. Maybe even so, I think we were both quite struck by what did happen. But I mean, in a sense, I mean, if you think about the usual way, the usual sort of criteria that you might use to decide whether to take somebody on as a PhD student, you know, you'd be sort of you know, assessing, you know, the quality of their work, the state of readiness, you know, whether you think they could do it in time, you know, certain, you know, of course you're making judgments, but you know, there was, I suppose, you know, there was something that suggested that there was, you know, there was a deeper meaning involved in his applying, that it wasn't just he wasn't just curious or you know, sort of self-interested or whatever, but that in some way he seemed to be genuinely connected to some process that was going on, that wasn't, that, going back to the previous question, wasn't just ego oriented. You know, there was something about that. So the way I understand disenchantment, you know, based on what Weber writes, is that it you know, it implies these three main sort of qualities of you know, a loss of a sense of mystery, that, you know, there being no intrinsic meaning in reality and no real connection to the sacred. And I think what synchronicity does is it undoes all of those, you know, so it breaks the spell that those things cast, and you know, it shows that there is mystery. It shows that there is meaning, which is not just meaning that you're projecting, but that meaning that is somewhere or other is actually emerging creatively, involving oneself, but creatively within the situation, and that there is some connectedness to processes, intelligent, caring processes that are that transcend our ordinary and empirical understanding, if you like. So
I'm wondering, Roderick, if you were talking about doubts related to the candidate. I'm wondering if those doubts came from a very rational place.
Then
yes. The synchronistic event broke through.
Yes, you could say that. I mean, there was the doubts were partly, was there sufficient academic preparation? It wasn't bad, but was it enough? But the second thing was actually, it was curious because part of the doubt was that was whether he was too in the magical world, too enclosed, too encapsulated in the Jungian frame of thinking, in a magical way of thinking, and so on, and wasn't academic enough. That was part of my doubt, But it's interesting now that you mention it that a rather bizarre synchronistic event is what sort of persuaded me not to be too concerned about that issue. Yeah.
Very good. Thank you.
Yeah. Thanks.
Well, thank you, Daniel. And as you said, Roderick, the question and answer session is sometimes the richest portion. So that illuminated something for me specifically. So I guess next, let's go to Charles. And again, I don't know what order people put their hands up in, but Charles, you are next.
Hello.
Hi.
Thank you for a really great talk, Roderick.
Okay, thank you.
I sat down this morning with a couple questions for you prior to your talk, and I think you've gone fairly deeply into one of the questions, but maybe this will give you an opportunity to expand a little bit more. So let me just state what I was wanting to ask. First question was, how do you achieve re-enchantment without regression? And the second related question is, because you've formed an analogy between individuation and enchantment, disenchantment, re-enchantment. Is that a Western cultural phenomenon in a sense? In other words, is there a need to necessarily go through a disenchantment stage in a civilization, or could we imagine that we could move through a progressive unfolding of enchantment to a more complex understanding of enchantment, and and somehow not have to engage the disenchantment that our civilization's in right now?
Thank you. Yeah, very, very good questions. And I mean, just to take the first one first about how do you achieve re-enchantment without regression? I mean, I think, my own view, which I think is, I base this on what I find in Jung's work actually, is that that some form of what you might want to call disenchantment is necessary. In other words, that I distinguish between a naive form of enchantment, which is a sort of immersion in a kind of fantasy world, or in a world in which everything is taken care of magically, a kind of a world of infancy, as it were, and the need to sort of become more realistic and independent, and to develop abilities that sort of enable one to get a grip on the world and to control the world, manipulate the world to some extent in one's own way. And that's a process that is disenchanting. in relation to that earlier naive enchantment. And you know, and this is very much the process that Jung described, the sort of developmental process that Jung would describe. But then at a certain point in Jung's model in midlife, that process of disenchanting and gaining kind of mastery of one's life and so on can go too far, and becomes one finds oneself fulfilled in all outward ways, but not necessarily inwardly anymore. And there's a sort of a call to sort of reconnect with a more magical or enchanted way of being, and then that's when the sort of the process of individuation proper sort of kicks in, if you like, and when that happens, one is learning how to sort of reconnect with perhaps what that sense of wholeness, a deeper sense of wholeness that one had, in a sense of deeper relationship with things and with others and with nature, and with something beyond society and nature. But one's doing it now in a state of consciousness rather than in a state of unconsciousness, and that's, I suppose, the critical difference, you know, so that it's one's reacquiring a deeper sense of wholeness, but now it's conscious wholeness. So that would be what I would say about how, you know, you can achieve re-enchantment without regression. Well, I don't know whether it's without regression. I'm sure there are moments of regression involved in that process, you know, for all of us, but not an absolute regression, if you like. The overall tendency is towards a new state of re-enchantment, not the old former state of sort of immersion in a naive sense of enchantment. So that's what I would say to that. Is it necessary at a cultural level to go through, or even at an individual level for that matter, to go through a state of disenchantment? I mean, maybe one wouldn't want to call it that. Maybe one only has to call it that, you know, in a culture that has become radically divorced from mystery and meaning and the sacred. You know, maybe in other cultures and at other times one didn't need to call it that. I'm sure something of that basic process of needing to gain enhanced powers and capacities for differentiation, discrimination, you know, understanding and so on are important, however they come about. You know, and then sort of connecting them to a sort of a renewed or revitalized sense of increasing wholeness and interrelationship and meaning. So I think, you know, I think those processes are probably always going to be there, but maybe for other cultures, maybe for individuals within certain cultures, even within you know, highly sort of disenchanted Western cultures, for some lucky individuals, the process can be more harmonious than it is for many others, you know, in the sense that we don't have to experience being so radically disenchanted. You know, that maybe one, you know, there are ways in which one can maintain a better balance going through that sort of process of acquiring what the positive aspects of disenchantment are. I don't know if that sort of addresses what you were asking.
It does. I just want to put a little addendum / clarification on a related point. Jung made use of Lévi-Bruhl's notion of participation mystique, and that's kind of become problematical, that usage of that term these days. Is there a nice way to sidestep that without losing, I think, what was Jung's initial intent with it, but not be seen as in denigrating peoples of so-called primitive societies?
Yeah, I mean, yeah, I mean, I don't think, I mean, if one takes the term participation or participation with, you know, without necessarily sort of tethering it to the to the the ways in which Lévi-Bruhl used it, or the arguments that have surrounded Lévi-Bruhl's use of it, I don't think there's necessarily a great problem. I mean, our first speaker, Rick Tarnas, writes an awful lot about participation. It's very key to the way he understands the kind of present state of what needs to be done in the present state of consciousness. And I think he's, it's about sort of recognition, as he was saying in his talk, about of a reciprocity between us and the world and the reality that we're in, that we treat the world, our reality, as a thou, as a a responsive being, and behave towards it in that way, and that actually gains a sort of enables, we participate in our reality in that way, and that has sort of more beneficial effects, more positive outcomes than if we treat reality impersonally, as though it doesn't really have any reality. It's inferior to us and capable is not really, it doesn't have any intelligence with which to respond to us, or any sort of aims or so on with which to respond to us. And if we treat it in that kind of way, then we'll get the kind of response we deserve, possibly, and so an assumption of that we are relating to something which is is a thou rather than a nit, enables a particular kind of participation, and I think that in relation to sort of earlier peoples, I mean, or indigenous peoples or whatever, rather than sort of projecting onto them that they don't have certain rational faculties. Right. I mean, obviously there's been lots of anthropological research which has shown that indigenous cultures have exquisitely rational ways of operating. They're just different from the ones that are operative in sort of modern technologized cultures. Right. But I think the key point about the relationship to nature, to one another, to society, and to something the sacred, or something that transcends both of those, is equally valid in both cases. Yeah.
Thank you very much.
Yeah. Thank you for the question.
Yeah, thank you, Charles. I think many of us feel like we're in a participatory universe, and so bringing up disenchantment is part of what we're witnessing in individual lives and society, and as a species way too. It reminded me of a series Pari had a while back where they had indigenous scientists as part of the panels, and their description of how difficult it was to work in a Western model of science. These are all folks academically credentialed and at high positions, but their understanding of seeing a relationality within science when we break it apart into parts and pieces, and the difficulty for them to work in a world that only prize the pieces and the parts. So anyway, thank you. And I appreciate whoever put out who was next in the queue as far as our hands up, and I believe that's Dieter. So thank you.
Thank you. First of all, I really enjoyed your summary, lovely summary of Jung's ideas on synchronicity. Thank you very much. I'm in Kingston, Ontario, in Canada, and I have a background in physics and astronomy, and currently nominally retired, but still working as a supply teacher in our local school system. You were mentioning of the Jung's astrological experiment, and also the earlier mention of astrology by Rick Tarnas triggered memories of my, I guess, reading about the research of French psychologist Michel Gauquelin. I don't know if you're familiar with his work. I thought it's worth mentioning because I feel his research is being forgotten and no longer front and center. he set out to I guess try and well, he wanted to settle the problem of astrology once and for all from a statistical point of view, and looked at earlier studies that where things had not been well thought out, the expectation values were incorrect and so on, and then discovered to his surprise correlation initially between successful athletes and the planet Mars just rising or culminating, and later on tied it into other successful professions, and finally tied it into personality types. So I just wanted to mention it and ask you whether you're familiar with it. And I mean, it's sort of, for me, initially, the first book I read by him, I was a graduate student in astronomy, and the English title was The Scientific Basis of Astrology. And I thought I would have a good laugh. And I was, I think, very impressed, and certainly opened my mind to alternate ways of looking at reality.
Mm-hmm.
And I did not become an astronomer because I felt it was too bleak an environment to be working in academically. And so anyway.
Mm.
So I guess my question is, are you familiar with that research? And is it still out there in the circles that you move in?
Yeah, I mean, I am familiar with the fact of the research. I haven't sort of read it closely myself, and you know, I do take divination quite seriously, but my mode of divination of choice is the I Ching rather than astrology. So I never really became tremendously familiar with astrology to the point where I was, you know, I suppose I felt, you know, that Gauquelin's work was, you know, was something I really needed to sort of engage with and understand. But I have, you know, I have sort of encountered and been involved with sort of, you know, I've examined theses on you know, serious theses on astrology and so on, which you know, my sense, my recollection, it's a bit dim, I'm afraid, this was some years ago, is that it, you know, it is, you know, there is still something that's quite challenging about his results, but also there's, you know, it's not really, I feel broken through in the sense that it's not definitively established anything, at least not in a kind of mainstream way that would be consoling to astrologers. I mean, I may be wrong about that, but it seems still to be controversial, I guess, is what I'm saying. But to be honest, I've not really kept an eye on the debates myself to know. But it's a puzzling thing to me. I mean, I know Rick Tarnas, you know, and he was himself convinced by his own sort of work on what he's now calling archetypal astrology, of the, you know, that there is some sort of big ongoing synchronicity between the sort of planetary movements and events that unfold in you know, on the Earth and in life in various ways, obviously sort of interpreted through the lens of archetypes and all the complexity that introduces. You know, I mean, it's not a straightforward sort of determinism or a minuscule prediction of exact things that are going to happen or anything like that. You know, and I'm kind of personally quite open to that as a possibility. There's also other ways in which people work with astrology, which is much more divinatory in the kind of way that that the I Ching is, you know, where the you know, you do an astrological reading at a particular moment, and it's somehow, you know, it's like an I Ching divination. It gives you an insight or provides you with, you know, it sort of activates your intuitions about that particular moment in some way. So I find this all deeply interesting, but you've caught me at one of my blind spots. This is perhaps something I do need to know more about. So,
I mean, I think Gauquelin's research wasn't really about divination, but rather,
I know it was science. I know it was science.
Positions of planets, they were either rising or culminating, and tying it ultimately to personality types.
Yeah,
which seem to mirror the traditional astrological
Yeah.
symbolism, if you like.
Mhm.
But I agree with you. Still, yeah, divination. I mean, I look at horoscopes once in a blue moon, and it's because I'm looking at it that particular time that it's important and synchronistic and it's meaningful. But if you look at it every day, it kind of flattens out. And so the key is that the fact that you're doing it at that particular moment. So I mean, I agree with everything you've said.
Yeah. I mean, in a way, that's similar to what you've just said is similar to what Jung concludes actually on the basis of his astrological experiment, isn't it? That he suggests that maybe people who developed these astrological traditions did so on the basis of the kind of scientifically questionable lucky hits like the ones that he had. That they also happen to get the results at the particular times in the particular ways, and a sufficient number of times for it to seem like this, but in fact it's not something that is replicable or testable within a scientific framework. But yeah.
Well, thank you, Dieter. Thank you for bringing that name in, Goquin. It was Mr. Tarnas that put some credibility to it all, to my world, which I was dismissive of it previously. And it is wonderful to think of it as possibly being an element of synchronicity, that it does the experimenter effect that can play with things in a trickster way or manifest in your moment of inquiry. And so that it's informed my particular way of seeing it in a different light. But thank you for that. And I think on the only hand up next I see is Marjorie. Thank you. And you're muted.
Muted.
You're still muted. Marjorie, we can't hear you.
If you go to the bottom left of your screen, your little screen of yourself, you should be able to see something.
I don't know if Michael can manually unmute.
I don't know that I have the power to actually unmute an individual.
Okay. That would take a wand. Well, until we solve that, does anybody else have any questions to enter in? I didn't see any more hands up, but until we can hear Marjorie's voice.
There are some more questions. More people come through. Marjorie, just have a look at the bottom left of your screen.
I'm doing it, but it
there
won't.
You go.
It won't unmute.
It has unmuted. You did
Can
it.
you hear me now?
Yes.
You got it.
Yes.
Yeah.
I was clicking every button over and over again, and I apologize for that. So
Okay.
I do truly apologize for that. Well, quite a lot was said on astrology. I learned from Rick Tarnas and Stan Groff, who did an excellent presentation on astrology for the Shift Network, a basic one and then an advanced one where they did Jung's chart and Stalin and everybody else, and proved to me. And you can also study, if you want to learn something, with the Liz Green and the rest in London at the School of Psychological Astrology. So I recommend that to the doubters. Anyway, I use astrology in every one of my psychotherapy sessions, I guess you could say, not every session, but every client, as did Jung in the last 10 years of his life. He wouldn't do a treatment unless he had the astrological chart done. And so I don't see it as divinatory at all. And I also use the I Ching and study the I Ching deeply. But what I see astrology doing is showing me which archetypes are going to be activated in that particular life. In other words, which planets and which houses, and that lets me know what's the deeper material that needs to come into play during that lifetime, and that helps me lead the client towards it. which takes me back to synchronicity. Thank goodness I don't work in academia. I walked away years ago. I left a younger sister in there, poor thing. But so I don't think rationally anymore. I think intuitively, almost exclusively. So if I can avoid rational positive thinking, then I do. So I can get away with that. I guess you can't. I would say that working with clients, we have to work with synchronicity. That's another must or given in any psychotherapy. And that's because it seems to me that there are different layers that are going on. There's the archetypal layer, and that's what the synchronicity is trying to tell us. Again, what's in the depth. What's supposed to come up for this client, what needs to be activated and constellated. And no one has said a word about the unconscious, but I believe that synchronicity is tied inevitably to unconscious material that's trying to arise. And that's how we become whole. That's how we are able to individuate, is to add in that unconscious material. And the way we find it in many ways is through dreams, but of course through synchronicity is another way to find what's in the unconscious. And so I don't know if you obviously don't think the way I do in many because we're coming from two different worlds. I'm 100% psychotherapy, but I'll do whatever I have to do, in order to help the client. So I don't see that synchronicity is occurring unless it is numinous, unless it is enchanted, and unless it does bring about a sense of a greater wholeness for the client. And otherwise, I wouldn't say that just running into somebody is synchronicity unless there is something behind that the self needs to know. And I think that the self does evoke opportunities of synchronicity in order to help it individuate and to help the person become more whole and more and larger. And I don't believe that we're ever not whole. This parts therapy is something I don't do either. I think we're always whole. We just get bigger. So do you subscribe at all to my thinking that synchronicity might be overused? Maybe that's happening in situations that aren't numinous or enchanted?
Yes, I do think it is overused often. And I agree pretty much with everything you've said, I have to say, just now. So thank you for putting it all so clearly. And it was unintentional if I didn't sort of highlight the role of the unconscious. I mean, in a sense, when I was referring to individuation and the self and so on, I suppose I was being too compressed because it was kind of implicit, because that is a process of synthesizing the consciousness and the unconscious and so on. It's not there's no individuation without engaging the unconscious, I don't think. So I entirely agree with you there. But I mean, the question of synchronicities being the term being misused or overused, I agree it often is. And that certain things are called synchronicities when maybe they're not. But I think it's also the case that things which don't initially seem like they might be synchronicities may be so. It's like when one has a dream and the dream can seem utterly trivial. You pay attention to the dream, do some work with the dream, it can suddenly unfold and become tremendously important and full of directions and meanings and so on. And I think it's the same with synchronicities. So I wouldn't sort of dismiss them because they don't, have a kind of whiz bang quality or anything like this. I know that's not what you were suggesting, so it's mainly really how one works with them or how one relates to them. I mean, I would give, if I had a seemingly insignificant coincidence experiences, I would give them I would give them some attention. And if they don't yield anything, they don't yield anything, and then maybe they don't have anything. But I wouldn't sort of dismiss them because they don't seem prima facie to be very, very relevant, or very powerful. Because things can, the little trivial things can surprise one very often, I think. So that would be my sense of that. Yeah.
Well, I think I agree with you, and I think that the synchronicity is working in the service of wholeness.
Yeah.
And if it doesn't seem like it's moving us towards a greater sense of self, then perhaps we can walk away from that particular occurrence. Is it helping us? I'm not saying walk away because it may find meaning later. I didn't mean to put it that way, but we need to focus in psychotherapy anyway on those
absolutely,
that are, immediately helpful.
Yeah.
And I would just say one last thing that I find, since I live in the enchantment of having already retrenched and, done what I had to do to survive in the world, not necessarily regression. Sometimes I consider it just retrenchment. I find myself living in enchantment all the time, and I have 4 or 5 or 8 or 10 synchronicities every single day. So it is important that I pick and choose amongst them to see which one is going to further my development.
Yeah. Okay. Thank you very much.
Yeah, thank you, Marjorie. I think a dilemma for all of us is deciding what the difference between coincidence and synchronicity is, and that always comes to meaning. And like Roderick was saying, that meaning may not be manifest till something else happens that ties it to the original. And that's, I know for myself in retrospect, there's been moments where something seemingly trivial suddenly wasn't with the context that's provided with time. So thank you, Marjorie. And I believe the last hand up is Max. We're missing Max.
You're still muted, Max, and you've put your video off as well somehow. So if you hover your cursor over the bottom left of your screen, and a red button should be there, should appear, and if you click on that, then it should unmute you.
Well, just as time's running out, we do have Bruce, and if Max pops back up, we'll go back to Max. But Bruce, you had the floor before, so we'll all keep everything short, and maybe Max will reappear.
Okay. Yeah, the question of constellating an archetype comes to mind. Of course, Jung saw before World War II the archetype of Wotan, which I'm probably not pronouncing that right, as being a dominant thing. Constellating in people's minds based on their dreams. And the same thing has happened in America and in other places around the world, but especially in America. I don't know if there's something you can say about the world situation and constellating archetypes as a passing thing.
Well, it's a very, very good and a very big question. I don't really have, I think it's something worth looking out for, whether things are constellating, whether there are any signs of things constellating. I don't know. I haven't got any particular sort of insight into it, I have to say, at the moment. But I don't discount that people could, discern these patterns. I think it's just a bit. So it's a kind of very, given the scale of things and the specificity of the contexts in each different place where difficult stuff seems to be happening, or unexpected stuff seems to be happening. I think it's always worth looking for the deeper patterns that might be sort of unfolding. But I think on a global scale, I don't feel I've, I probably don't watch enough news to take in enough information to be able to speak with any sort of
Yeah. Well, I think there's a lot of astrology going on. I haven't really kept up
Yeah.
with all that either, but there's certainly things going on there. But
Yeah. Well, I mean, those would be a perspective. That would be a perspective that might give some insight onto that.
all right, well, thanks.
Okay.
I didn't get Zoom.
Looks like we have Max back. So
All right. Okay.
thank you, Bruce. And Max, you squeezed in under the wire.
Yes, I'm so sorry for that. I went to unmute my phone and I lost Zoom altogether.
All right. Okay.
So I'll try to be quick. I so appreciate the Pari Center and all of these sessions and yours, along with all of that. So very quickly, I went off in the, graduated from high school, went off to college on a kind of science-based to an Eastern college. I at time realized science wasn't gonna do it for me. I arced over into Carl Jung and read a whole lot, and what finally settled for me was the Memories, Dreams, and Reflections, where it seemed like an enormous part of his experience of his life experiences was in New Mexico with Native people and of course other indigenous people. And I noticed, and this is going to the comments yesterday by our wonderful person about the value of a word, because synchronicity in a way is coincidence with some meaning attached to it or found in it, but we keep talking about Western and Eastern. We go into that, and if you think from the terms of, Eurasia, the big continent, and the subcontinent of India, that's kind of where the divide is. And then we talk about here. I'm in San Francisco. I was born on Turtle Island, conceived here. We talk about it as the Western Hemisphere. And then we can think about the below the equator, the Southern Hemisphere. Those are left out by that, just using the language of Eastern and Western, and that sort of dichotomy. And so I just want to speak to that in the sense of how valuable words are. And at the same time, just like metaphors, they can often trap us in something. Some wonderful metaphors work to a point, and then they fall apart, or they keep us limited. So I just wonder if you might speak to that larger way within our language of, the spell, breaking the spell of disenchantment, which is breaking the spell of the spell. How we use language and how we might use it in a way, speaking with each other amongst ourselves.
Yeah, thank you. That's a very, very good question and very, very important. And yes, I mean, Jung talked in these ways about East and West and so on. He didn't talk particularly about North and South, or and he had his own understanding, I suppose, of what those were. And I suppose when I'm talking about Jung, I sort of get into that frame myself perhaps a bit too much.
Can I just throw, I also meant to mention, always in these conversations, we talk about indigenous people as somehow, they're not party to all of this. They kind of understand this already, or they have their own. Everybody in this community anyway seems to get that. And I wanted to add that into that thing, because I've had a lot of experience with Native American people and some with Australian Aborigines. And so that's influenced all of my thinking with all of this. So I'm sorry, I just wanted to be sure that was in there too.
Yeah, okay, thank you. Yeah. Well, I mean, my sense of, the potential within a concept like synchronicity is that I mentioned in one of the early slides about how for Jung, synchronicity is intrinsically related to individuation, the process of realizing the self, this sense of wholeness and so on, and how that in his later work in particular, but really implicitly all the way through, I think, or certainly from quite early on, wholeness for him, really was, a depth of wholeness, a sort of a common ground of human experience, if you like. And he referred in his late works, all right, it's based on Western alchemy and so on, but he referred to this concept of the unus mundus. Of course, that's a Western Latin term, but it means one world. And I think he meant one world. He was referring to a sort of a world, as it were, beyond the empirical world at all, the sort of the ground of potential out of which all different cultures and civilizations and communities, and all the, you know, everything that, you know, that we know emerges. And I think it really does mean a one world, you know. So you know, of course, you know, we're all localized, and we've all got our limitations. So there will be limitations in the way we speak and try and address things. But I think concepts like that do give a reference point to realize that you know, that ultimately we are talking about something which, and if it doesn't connect with everyone, it should do. You know, it's that, you know, it should be potentially it ought to do. You know, if it really is talking about the, you know, the common human experience. So, you know, I've got my limited way of talking about that, which won't satisfy everyone from every perspective, but, you know, and other people talk about these things in different ways, but you know, I think there is a commonality, you know, at the core of things, and I think that's what Jung was gesturing towards with his work, as many other people do from their different perspectives. I don't know if that speaks to what you were saying, but
yeah, it does. I just, you know, we are caught in our language and our ways that we, you know, we talk about individuation. Lakota had their vision quests, and a lot of other of the nations or tribes or communities had, you know. So it's not in a way that was Europeans waking up.
Yeah.
So Jung was very, very helpful in getting Europeans.
Yeah. Well, I mean, if you remember, I don't know if you were at Rick Tarnas's talk last week, but he made the very interesting point that the very concept of synchronicity, you know, probably wasn't needed until the modern Western context. You know, it's a concept that is helpful in the current context, some parts of the current context, for reorienting towards something which, you know, can be related to in lots of different ways. But thank you for that very much for that point and question.
All right, thanks for letting me get in there.
And thank you, Max, for reminding once again the delicate dance that is language. We are limited by it, and we're also burdened and enjoyed by it. But anyway, we're over time, and a thank you to Roderick. I don't know if you have any last words, but I will just thank you from a personal standpoint for bringing all these folks together in your depth of scholarship to remind endlessly the perennial relevance of Mr. Jung and his observations and what it means for the future too. The plea for the humanities is a call we wish was louder. I hope it does get louder. There's many articulate voices calling for such, but yours was one today. So if you have any last words, love to hear them. And if not, we'll sign off. But I thank you from myself, and I'm sure most folks in the audience.
Well, very, very, very briefly, just to thank you very much, Todd, for chairing this so admirably, and thank you to all the participants for being here today and during the other sessions, and in particular to those people who asked questions, for asking such searching and insightful questions, which you know, is for me always the great payoff of giving a talk, is that you get sort of queried and questioned and see so many things that one hadn't suspected or seen before. So thank you very much, everyone.
Thank you all, and hopefully we'll see each other in all next week, and maybe even in the flesh in Pari one day. So until next, thank you.